Good morning, everybody. How's my sound? Am I audible? I'm usually audible in any scenario. Um, okay. Hi. All right, I'm looking at everybody. Welcome. Sorry that I'm not there. Did it snow? What happened? Was it worth not coming? Was it gnarly? Okay, good. Um, I'm glad to know it wasn't in vain. And thanks to Myorin Terra Hall for getting on the phone with Delta and preserving the investment that we made in my plane ticket so that it can be used at a later date, which is a difficult thing to do. Because when you give companies money, they don't like to give it back or make it used for other things. It turns out. Um, so when we scheduled this talk, I had a bee in my bonnet at that time, and I have this thing where I get bees in my bonnet and they don't really stay because of the wings, and um, and but we were fresh off of our Rahatsu session, which we did at the beginning of December, and we did it on this Chinese poem called "The Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi." So I wanted to talk about the Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi, but then I'm thinking, um, do y'all know what the Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi is? Do you ever chant it there? Do you give a shit about it? And if you don't, then maybe I don't need to talk about it, or maybe it'll influence the content that I'm talking about, but I don't need to necessarily refer to the text and unpack the text, especially if you don't have a pre-existing relationship to it. So I want to gauge the room. And does anybody care about the Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi, or do you want me to just omit the commentarial aspect of it and still give you the gist? And the gist is always, whenever there's a textual commentary, the gist should always be what the point of what we're doing is. So the text is just this jumping off point to what the point of what we're doing is in Zen practice. But I don't know, any feeling
So
how
we had Max said he cares, Benji cares, Tara cares, I'm Vicky and I care. George, do you care?
Oh, yeah, I care.
Yeah, cares. Okay, so that's so far what people have been saying.
okay.
Actually, we chanted at least once a week during the week.
Great. Okay, great. So the Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi is how to talk about this. All right, I'll start at the beginning. Buddhism is the world's first missionary religion. Isn't that interesting? We usually don't think of it like that because it's like the only religion that has its own magazines at the health food store, and so we think of it as this almost a-religious kind of thing, and that's why it's kind of safe for us. There's no dogmas, there's no gun-toting clergy, but there are. And we're just kind of protected from that aspect of it in 21st century United States. But if you're in Thailand, the conservative people are the Buddhists. The homophobes are Buddhists. The militant people oppressing ethnic minorities are Buddhists. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, and it's not, and to know that really in terms of scriptural spreading, it was the earliest religion to really be doing that. Because if you look at some other, apart from Christianity, there's a lot of other religions kind of this is kind of for us. And this isn't something that I'm trying to make everybody else do necessarily, but Christianity and Buddhism are really kind of no, this is good for all of y'all, and we need to spread the word here, and that being so, if you look at Buddhism beginning in South Asia, what we now call India, which was, maybe a cluster of different kingdoms there. And it spread all along, from the north along the Silk Road into East Asia. So we're talking China, we're talking Japan, we're talking Korea, into the Himalayan region, we're talking Bhutan, Tibet, Mongolia, even what is now Russia had Buddhists in antiquity, and then through Sri Lanka, and then what we call the Southern Transmission, and to Southeast Asia, your Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. Vietnam's kind of interesting because it's nestled in between East Asia and Southeast Asia, so it has a blend of Chinese and Theravadan cultural influences. So if you ever come across like Thich Nhat Hanh, it's like, is this Zen or is this like Theravadan? It's a little bit of both because of his positionality geographically. Yeah. Now, this interesting thing happened when Buddhism entered China. When Buddhism entered China, it encountered something that it didn't really encounter when it entered areas of Southeast Asia and when it entered Tibet and the Himalayas. And it's that China already had a pre-existing literary and philosophical tradition. So it had that to contend with. So we had the first kind of blending of cultural sensibilities. It's like, how do you graft Buddhism into a civilization that is already very, very, very developed and has its own philosophical traditions and its own kind of cultural identity and ethos and its own literature? Because a lot of other countries, like, Tibet learned how to write from India. Like the Tibetan language mirrors Sanskrit in various ways. So Buddhism entering China created this unique situation for it. And early on, and so we're saying, maybe Buddhism started entering China around 200 AD or something like that. And then when we call the beginning of the Zen school, the kind of mythological beginning of the Zen school with Bodhidharma, we're talking 500 or 600 AD. And early on, we started having these texts that are a synthesis of Buddhist and Chinese sensibilities. And when we're saying Chinese sensibilities, we're saying things that are influenced by both Taoism and what in the West we tend to call Confucianism. Confucianism is very, very multifaceted. I think if you're gonna, spend any time in the Zen world, it's a thing worth exploring. Especially if you're gonna spend time training as a teacher or becoming a priest or something in the Zen world, I think Confucianism is very worth exploring because it makes a lot of sense of the way that we do things, So like when you go to a Zen center and you learned, let's say you go to a Vipassana center, and you go for meditation instruction, they're probably just going to teach you how to meditate. But if you go to a Zen center and go to meditation instruction, like, here's how we hold our hands. Here's how we enter the room. Here's what this sound means. That's all Confucianism. That's all the East Asian way of sharing space together. Because there's an idea, there's a sensibility in Confucianism called Li. And Li means like ritual propriety. And it's like, if we know how to be together in a harmonious way, it brings heaven and earth together. And there is a dignified, pre-prescribed way based on the history of the culture of how to interact with humans and objects. And that is very, very alive in the way that the Zen tradition is practiced. And so sometimes if you're like spending time in Zen spaces and say it's going to be a sesshin and they're teaching you how to use the eating bowls, the oryoki eating bowls or something like that, you're like, gosh, this is such a headache. Why do I have to learn how to do it like this? And it's like, because it makes sense and it's gorgeous and it brings heaven right down to earth when we do it like this, instead of making it willy-nilly, instead of making it up to you. So the Confucian sensibilities were kind of utilized for the development of the character of the individual that's practicing Buddhism. Now, when it comes to the literature, in all of the early Buddhist texts, so what we could probably call the earliest Zen text is this text that maybe you've come across in Japanese. We call it the Shin Shin Ming. No, that's not Japanese. That's Chinese. Shin Shin Ming, Shin Jin Mei in Japanese. In English, we'll call it the trust in mind or faith in mind text. And that's really early, second ancestor, supposedly third ancestor, I think. So we're talking like 600 AD. And already in that text, you had a lot of Taoist language in the way that the teachings are described. And then you fast forward to about, I think, 700 or 800, we're looking at this text, the Song of the Jewel Mirror. And we got our work cut out for us, because when we're looking at the East Asian texts, they're a lot more cryptic and a lot less straightforward than when we're looking at South Asian texts. South Asian texts are very kind of philosophical in a way that like seems almost kind of familiar to a Eurocentric mindset. But when we look at the East Asian way of writing and describing things, kind of the wooden man begins to sing, the stone woman gets up dancing. What is going on here? You know, Yi with his archer skill could hit a target at 100 paces. But when arrow points me head on, what has it to do with the matter of skill? And you're like, what is going on here? You know, but like, you know, when you look at the South Asian text, it's like, let's define a thing. A thing is an object that has a function, you know, and then it's like there are 6 kinds of things, and like there are 51 types of mind. Number 1, you know, and it gets into it in a very kind of, and it's in a way that's like not very poetic, not very inspiring, you know, but a little bit less room for misinterpretation or confusion than when you get into the East Asian stuff, you know. And when I say East Asian, it's kind of cultures that are influenced by Chinese culture, basically, because that how strong the literary and philosophical tradition was in China, that had a huge influence on both Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Now, so when you look at this text, oh, here's the other thing, before we even get there. Now, there was an understanding about how we exist in the world in India that wasn't really shared in East Asia. So when you look at Indian writings on Buddhism, and even the whole Indian yogic, you know, body of thought, it seems to be that there's this idea that being alive is this kind of uncomfortable problem. And being reborn is a continuation of this uncomfortable problem. So what we're trying to practice for is trying to escape being reborn, you know. And even in the early texts, if you ever read the Nikayas or the Pali Canon, sometimes you hear this word escape, and sometimes you hear the word cessation. If you read the Metta Sutta, it says, one who practices in this way is not born again into this world. And then a lot of Zen centers go like, oh no, we can't have it say that. And then we change it and say it's freed from the duality of birth and death to make it a little bit more Zen. Now, why would we make that change? Because in the East Asian worldview, rebirth isn't the problem. That's a South Asian problem. That's an Indian problem. That's not part of the Chinese approach of what needs to be fixed. You know, so in Zen, we have a little bit more of like, I'm not trying to liberate myself from rebirth. I'm trying to awaken to what's really happening in this life right now. You know, and so when we're practicing in the US and we have access to Theravadan texts, Indian texts, yogic texts that aren't necessarily Buddhist, that are coming from Vedanta traditions or something like that, and you're looking at Zen and you're looking at Tibetan Buddhism, we got to understand the distinction between what the agenda is, because not all the Buddhisms have the same agenda because of the cultural influence and what was emphasized. And then the problem is, because since it's a religion that needs to be true and right, none of them can admit this. You know, at the end of the day, Zen people have to say, no, we're doing Buddhism. You know, how many times do you hear Zen teachers say, Shakyamuni Buddha sat Zazen under the Bodhi tree? And it's like, Zazen was invented in the 7th century. You know, the way that we do it, the approach that we have to it, the emphasis that we put on it, it's not part of the South Asian deal. It's a Chinese problem. And that's what we've inherited, you know? And being in the US, you have your choice. You can go to a Vipassana center. You can go to a Zen center, you know, depending on where you live. my teacher always said the best practice is the one that you do. So you don't have to figure out what the best tradition is. You got to figure out what place you can stand being, and then do that one. But knowing that when you're reading even what Buddha himself had to say about what practice is about, that doesn't necessarily reflect what a Zen student's approach to what practice is about. It doesn't have to be the same thing. And it often isn't if we look closely, Because when you're reading the Pali Canon, you're seeing Ananda say, yes, Blessed One, how do we achieve escape? You're like, escape? What the hell are these guys talking about? Because it's not really part of the Zen view. Now, what is Zen talking about? In early Buddhism, when they talk about interconnection or Thich Nhat Hanh popularized the word interbeing, that everything is contingent upon other things, that's part of the bad news of existence. That's part of what makes life so unstable, that everything's contingent upon everything else. But then when we get into our thing, it's kind of, that's the good news of existence. That's the beauty of existence, that everything's interconnected. So there's a positive spin on it or a negative spin on it, depending on whether you think human life is good or bad news. In early Buddhism, the only reason that a human life is good news is because it's not so miserable that you can't practice, and it's not so pleasant that you can't practice. So if you ever heard this term, Saha world, the Saha world is the world that we live in, means the barely tolerable world. It's bad enough so that you're motivated to do something about it, and it's not, but if it were more pleasant, you wouldn't be motivated to do anything about it. If it was more miserable, you'd be too miserable to do anything about it. So it's just miserable enough so that you can address the problem of what life feels like. And that's the ultimate fundamental issue with all of these yogic traditions. Things being what they are, I'm going to get sick. I'm going to grow old. I'm going to die. Everybody's killing each other. My brain is predisposed to do things that aren't good for it. My body is predisposed to do things that aren't good for it. No matter how many times I get up and say, I'm just going to eat kale and tofu today, by the end of the day, there's a donut in me somehow. How does that happen? Why would that mechanism work that way? And so the yogic traditions are like, here's what we think is happening. Here's what we're going to do about it. And a bunch of different answers about that, And so you're going to look at things practically. It's like, what addresses what I think my needs are from the world? I don't necessarily want to escape rebirth. I don't know what that means, but I want to do something that brings my life to life and helps me address it in a way that makes it savory and sustaining, So, the first line of the Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi is that a stretch or a hand raise? It's a stretch. Okay. The first line of the Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi. First of all, let's talk about the title. Song. It's a song. In Chinese, it's eight character couplets, and they all rhyme. They end on the oo sound. So it is a poem or a song. It's pretty easy to memorize, actually, in Chinese. For people that speak Chinese, it's easy to memorize in Chinese. The jewel mirror. Jewel mirror. So when we're talking about mirror became, over time, not early on, but over time in Buddhism, mirror became this way of describing how the mind exists, how the fundamental aspect of mind exists. So when we're talking about mind in Buddhism, it's very easy to think that when you hear the word mind in English, that they're talking about something that exists between here and here. They're talking about the brain. There's something that exists behind here. It's like, I don't know. It's like, so these are my eyes, so it must be right about there, where all of the me stuff happens, kind of right about here. So roughly approximates the brain, and that's what we think the mind is. But from a Buddhist point of view, the definition of mind is, the fundamental aspect of mind is that which is clear and knowing, or that which apprehends. So when something touches your finger and you feel it, not here, but right here, there's mind right here. There's mind in the hand. There's mind in the soles of the feet. There's mind in the nose that makes you smell. There's mind in the ear. It is the current that activates the possibility of apprehension in this lump of flesh. Does that make sense? It is the spark, So from a Buddhist point of view, when we say mind, you can, if you're thinking with a Western brain, you're thinking this is something about psychology or something vaguely kind of scientific. But from a Buddhist point of view, that's our closest thing to the soul. That's the most spiritual thing that we can talk about, the mind, because that is that which is creating the whole of experience is coming through mind. So one of my favorite quotes, someone asked, or I don't know if someone asked him, but Alan Wallace addressed the issue. Alan Wallace is a kind of secular-y Tibetan-y teacher based out of Santa Barbara. He wrote a few books, Attention Revolution, Buddhism with an Attitude, which is an obnoxious title, I think. He addressed the issue. It was Buddha a philosophical figure, a religious figure, or a psychological figure? And his answer was, he wasn't European. Those distinctions are Eurocentric distinctions, and that all of those kind of things are kind of married in the South Asian paradigm. So sometimes you hear people arguing whether Buddhism is a philosophy or a religion, and if they're saying it's not a religion, it's because that person doesn't like religion. And if they're saying it is a religion, it's because that person likes religion. I don't know. It's not European. Philosophical and religious are European distinctions. So mind is that which is clear and knowing. It is that which has the potential to apprehend something. So for that reason, it's often likened to a mirror, because a mirror just reflects. Reflections don't stain the mirror, and it just simply shows you what's in front of it, at its most fundamental level. Sometimes it's compared to a movie screen. It is the blank backdrop that makes every projection possible. If you didn't have the screen, you wouldn't be able to see anything. And then there's this term, so Song of the Jewel Mirror. Jewel, why is it jewel rather than just a mirror? Song of the clear mirror samadhi, song of the sky-like mirror samadhi. Why is it jewel? Because there's a lot of different facets to it. Like I just said, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine. That fundamentally clear and knowing is running through your whole system. Now, Samadhi. Samadhi is a Sanskrit term. And if you look at the definition of Samadhi, it's usually something like absorption or concentration. Has anybody ever encountered that definition of Samadhi? If you ever look up absorption or concentration. Now, this is an important distinction because Zen is not Theravadan Buddhism. Zen is not early Buddhism. When we say Samadhi and Zen, we're not talking about concentration. We're not talking about absorption, because strictly speaking, Soto Zen does not have a concentration practice as its central approach. And this is an easy thing to not really kind of grok, because there's so much cross-contamination about what different meditation methods are, But like if you go to Eiheiji, the headquarter temple of our monastery, they're not going to tell you to watch the breath. They're going to be like, here's how to get your back straight and go. It's like a long time on how to get the back straight. And then it's just like, and now don't do anything. 1, 2, 3, don't do anything. Don't make anything out of your experience. Sit in the experience of what's arising. It's the beginning and end of the practice. Sit in the experience of what's arising. It's very unsatisfactory. If you want some kind of trajectory, a developmental trajectory, where you get kind of, to tick boxes, to be like, I understand this and I didn't understand it yesterday. It's slow goings that way. Our way is really like, it's likened to walking in the mist, and then after 13 years, you realize your sleeves are soaking wet. but it doesn't occur to you as it happens. And then certain teachers and certain traditions get very, very excited about those moments where you actually have an experience where you they call it kensho. Ken means seeing, sho means nature, where you see the nature. And that's kind of often kind of dangled like some kind of like carrot. It's like if you do things right, if you don't move, if you let your nose run, if you come every day, and if you please me and impress me, the teacher, then you're going to have this thing where this ultimate gift, the gift of Zen, which is seeing your true nature. I'm speaking personally. To the best of my assessment, based on people that really, really emphasize this Kensho experience, it seems to be incredibly destabilizing to them. And I'm sorry to say, everybody that, classifies this Kensho experience as this like ultimate thing, it seems that it's the enemy of humility. And I think it undermines patience. And it undermines this kind of receptivity and sitting and not knowing and just sitting in the mind's nature. Now, so it's not that we don't have recognition, but it's that the recognition can be, Dogen says, what does he say? Something to the effect of, do not think that what you understand is going to kind of like make itself apparent to your knowledge. Something like, don't think that what you understand is necessarily going to make itself apparent to your knowledge. So this is this idea like, is your transformation going to entertain you? Is your transformation going to be this thing that you're going to be able to recognize and be like, all right, here we go. I got it. It only happens in this way that's like, the real flavor of awakening is the flavor of constantly being embarrassed of who you were 2 weeks ago. And constantly being compassionate for the one that you were 2 weeks ago. Because how would it be any other way? But this is the unfolding. So Samadhi in the Zen school is really just being present to the fundamental nature of mind as often as we can. And now the mirror-like quality of mind, when isn't it present? We do this guided meditation sometimes, like when I do these retreats that I was supposed to do yesterday, do this guided meditation where I have people either, notice an experience of pain that they're having in sitting, or and if they don't have one, you can kind of take your thumbnail and just kind of stick it in the side of your hand there, just to the point where you can feel it, just to the point where it's unpleasant. And you do that, and then you think, okay, this is an unpleasant sensation. Is awareness here? Is awareness the river that is flowing constantly as a backdrop between pleasant or unpleasant experiences? Is there a moment where I can, sometimes we say, oh, my meditation is not great, I've been distracted. It's like, when you're distracted, is awareness not present? Can you, like Peter Pan and his shadow, can you separate yourself from your awareness? So our practice is to recognize the inseparability of our waking life and awareness itself. And once we have this recognition of the ever-present and clear, luminous, empty quality of awareness, then that fundamental thing, that when you have that recognition, then that starts to be this gift that's with you all the time. Because it's like the beginning and end of what I'm experiencing is not the particularities of the meaning that I'm making out of it. You know, the particularities of the meaning that I'm making out of it are secondary to the fundamental quality of it. So one of the greatest descriptions I've heard of Zazen, of the Shikantaza method of Zazen. So Shikantaza, for those that are new, the Shikantaza is the, according to most, the fundamental practice of the Soto Zen tradition. Fundamental practice of the Soto Zen's founder, Dogen Zenji, from the 1200s. And Shikantaza means like nothing but sitting. We just sit and we don't do anything. We don't add to it, you know. And so Makoto Ikebe, which is a Japanese astrology, or what's the word when people like tell you about your star signs and stuff? Is that astrology? Yeah. There's a laywoman from Japan from the middle of the 20th century that did astrology out of her home. That was a lay Zen teacher. No rakusu, no nothing. And if you want to know more about her, you can look up the book "Living and Dying in Zazen" by Arthur Braverman, which I recommend the hell out of. Makoto Ikebe says Zazen is to sit upright and let delusion be. Let delusion be. You know, just hands off of it. Hands off of it. You know, sometimes, you know, as someone that's been in the biz for a minute, it seems that the number one cause of suffering is trying to do something about your suffering. You know, people are picking on that scab of the feeling of being a person. You know, all of the eating, all the disordered eating, and all the drinking, and it's all picking that scab of the feeling of being a person, and not being able to just really metabolize that and stabilize this vessel. Stabilize this vessel that can handle the feeling of being a person. You know, so in our Zazen practice, we're stabilizing the vessel that is the body mind that is receiving the feeling of being a person without trying to do anything about it, without trying to fix it. You know, because from a Buddhist point of view, the flavor of the feeling is due to karma. The flavor of the feeling, that's been set in motion since beginningless time. So when your mind encounters an object, based on all of your previous conditioning that's been laid down from beginningless time, what arises the moment that contact is made is a feeling tone, positive or negative. When we buy into that feeling tone, we do actions. We do actions based on attachment and aversion. We do actions based on exaggerating the positive qualities of the object. So we're imputing meaning onto the objects that we're apprehending. And objects that we're apprehending are even our own thoughts. Because from a Buddhist point of view, the thinking mind is one of your senses. The object of that sense is the thought. So just like the object of the nose sense is smells, the object of the thinking mind is mental formation. So that's why when you chant the Heart Sutra, they talk about mental formations as one of the skandhas, one of the heaps that makes the sense of being a person. You know, so you have you come into contact with a sight, a smell, a tactile sensation, and one of your own thoughts. And immediately coupled with that, based on your conditioning, is a positive or negative feeling. And then that influences the behaviors that you do. The behaviors that you do compound and anchor in that karma. If you're able to sit upright and have the positive or negative feeling without responding to it with attachment or aversion, if your mind is wide enough to metabolize that positive or negative feeling without adding on to it or addressing it or trying to scratch that itch or pick that scab, it's liberated. Negative feeling is the end of the cycle. Positive feeling is the end of the cycle of that kind of karmic continuum, that karmic existence. So our Zazen practice is two things. Recognizing the continuum of awareness as clear and luminous. And sitting within that clear and luminous continuum of awareness, letting feeling tones, not to be confused with the English word feelings, but the feeling tone, technical word vedana, which means positive or negative sensations that come up when you come into contact with objects, even objects of your own mind, even mental formations. When that feeling tone arises, don't make anything with it. No attachment, no aversion. Attachment or aversion are optional responses to positive and negative sensations. Yeah. No exaggerating the positive qualities of an object, thinking that proximity to it will increase happiness. No exaggerating the negative qualities of an object, thinking that separation from it or destruction of it will cause happiness. You know, sometimes you ever have a mood? Have you ever noticed yourself having a mood? You know, and when a mood arises, we don't really recognize it as a mood. We don't really recognize that I might be sad because innumerable unknowable reasons from going back to beginningless time. We think there's something I have to do. I'm probably hungry, or I probably need to cheer myself up somehow. I probably need to change my life situations. We start to think that it's an itch that needs to get scratched when we're sad, you know. When we're happy, we want to continue. How do we make this last longer? You know, and just be like, it's just weather, y'all. It's just weather. You don't have to do anything about it. You know, it is the unfolding of all the conditioning that's been laid down in your mind stream going back from before Jesus, before Moses, before horseshoe crabs, you know, beginningless time. Because, you know, in the world of cause and effect, you don't get a first moment. So your mind stream is as old as the stars. You know, and who knows why you feel the way you do. You know, and then there's pieces we can put together. You know, we can make constructive observations. You know, it's like this body mind actually is less prone to shame when it's been active. Or something like that. Like if I get on the elliptical machine for half an hour, I'm not going to feel sorry for myself at 10 p.m. Awesome. Great. Take that into consideration. You know? And so like in this text, the Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi, it goes, filling a silver bowl with snow, hiding a heron in the moonlight. So these are things that look like each other, but are distinct from each other. You know, taken as similar, they're not the same. When you mix them, you know where they are. So this is saying that it's not all one. You know, this doesn't mean that there's this blob of all oneness. There are distinctions, there are particularities, and there's function to things. And the function to things need to be honored and respected and abided by. You know, if I, what's a good example of a thing I like to eat? If when I was a kid, I don't know if they had this in the Midwest, but I grew up in California, and we had this candy called Lucas. And it was a little yellow can that had a little duck with sunglasses on and a leather jacket. And it was just salt, sugar, chili powder, and like lime flavor. And it was like, came in a shaker, and we'd dump it on our hands and we'd lick our hands. And it would make your like gums go numb, and it'd make your tongue really rough, you know? And it's like, that's cause and effect. You know, recognizing that. Why do I feel this way? You know, sometimes it's immediate and sometimes it's a little bit harder to distinguish, you know. So being able to abide in that way, utilizing the tools that you have and the knowledge that you have to create a stabler vessel for the metabolization of positive and negative feelings. You're not going to be able to get rid of all of your negative feelings, but you're going to be able to metabolize, to experience them without having to do something about it. And that's the development of this one. You know, one of the things from, I think it was in the, might be in Shantideva's Bodhicharya Vittara, which is a text from India from, well, kind of late, like maybe 900 or something like that. So Mahayana Buddhism, that's late. But said, you don't have to cover the world in leather, just cover the soles of your feet, in order to make it like comfortable, So to increase your comfort, becoming one that can handle the positive and negative feeling tones. How do you become one that can handle the positive and negative feeling tones? Practice experiencing them without moving. That's why we say don't move. Don't move. Not leaning towards and not leaning away from what's arising. And then what helps that is awareness of awareness, recognition of the ever-present continuum of the fundamental nature of mind, which is this clear and luminous awareness. And it's right there. You can't, it's like your shadow. There's no getting away from it. The clear and luminous awareness that is underlying every single experience you could ever have. If you're having an experience, that's proof that you have clear and luminous awareness. Every negative experience that you have is built upon clear and luminous awareness. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. So are you awake? Are you here? Are you a zombie? One of my teachers, Mingyur Rinpoche, he always starts meditation instructions saying, are you a zombie? And if you say no, that's great. You're here. You're awake. You have what you need. You have awareness, fundamental awareness. If you say yes, you are a zombie, there's no way to apprehend that without having the fundamental and clear awareness. So there's no way out of it. That feels good enough. I think we did the title in the first line. That's good. Any how long when am I supposed to stop? How long do we have to?
I think that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, when do we ultimately stop? Is it Q&A time, or are we done?
We have time we always have time for questions or comments.
Okay. Great.
If you do.
Yeah, I do. I thought I was going to live there today.
Anyone online? Anybody have comments? I would just say that this is very interesting because just before we came into the Zendo, we were having discussion about the background and differences between Buddhism in India and South Asia and China. So very educational.
Yeah. Basically, when you're looking at East Asian Buddhism, when you're looking at Japan, Korea, China, and to an extent Vietnam, the fundamental difference is, apart from the influence of Taoism and Confucianism, is that it's a little bit more this life oriented. It's a little bit less like escape the cycle of rebirth. They're going to give lip service to escaping the cycle of rebirth because they have to, because it's religion and you got to be true to the tradition. But in practice, it doesn't seem to feature so much, Well,
our newcomers today actually have in the past gone to a Lotus Monastery, which as a matter of fact, Tara and Sarah and I just made a visit to this week. It's across the river and it's a Vietnamese Buddhist temple. And I found that when we walked up, there's a lot of sayings written on the front of it. There's calligraphy inside with sayings, and it was all very familiar. And to me, goes to the heart of what's it about. Anyway. So it's interesting.
I have a question. Share some insight in, maybe.
Jose?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I was in the last 24 years, I've been married or was married, 4 kids, 18, 16, 15, 14. 4 months ago, I went to jail, got divorced, and lost everything. But meanwhile, I never really talked to my brother, which that's my brother, in those 24 years, like at all. We were always on opposite ends of life. If basically my question is why the change, or what would be your insight on losing that whole family life, and then now talking to my brother that I never really spoke to in the last 24 years.
Mm. Well, a big disruption like that would rewrite habits, so if there's anything that's been sustained, if there's any, because talking and not talking to people is just is something that kind of perpetuates itself. And things that perpetuate themselves are held in place by life circumstances, and so when someone at some point, when the other shoe drops and the life circumstance changes radically, then everything that's been holding who you've been in place has this opportunity to restructure itself, and that can go various ways. There could be positive and negative aspects of that, or a blend of the two, but it would make sense to me that when a structure that held distance in place went away, then this opportunity for a coming together would arise. Does that make sense?
Yep, that's all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't talk to my sister a ton. And when I got arrested once, and when I got arrested, my sister was my best friend, because like that there's a contract there, theoretically, ideally with family, there's a contract there that actually I changed your diapers, and even though you don't like what school I send my kids to or whatever, like I'm gonna come help you, Yeah.
Makes sense.
Anybody else have a question or a comment?
Tara and Max, looks like.
Should I call on people? Sorry, I'll call. I don't know who. I don't know if it's who's facilitating. So I can start calling on people. Max tried to talk quite a while ago. So why don't we do Max first?
Okay. I think Tara and I have been kind of going back and forth on that. It's just enough people online. I think that's a little hard to coordinate. I feel like I have a million questions I could ask, but the I guess sort of more technical one I wanted to bring up here was when you mentioned that Zen doesn't really have this concentration element to it, that there's not this focus on like the breath or on visualizations or these sorts of techniques. I was under the impression, at least, that the etymology of the word Zen kind of drew from this concentration element, like Pali dhyana to Sanskrit jhana to Chinese chan and eventually to Japanese Zen. What I had encountered, at least before, was not so much that there isn't a concentration element, but it's sort of married to this, just leaving it be that it's this objectless form of concentration. Is that just like a different way of making the same point, or is there something else being discussed there?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. Because it's easy, we have this thing that is understandable, especially not having a lot of access to a living tradition that's been sustained over centuries. We're kind of like trying to piece back together our own history, because sometimes it goes back to like our teacher came from Japan, and we're kind of cut off from before that or something like that. So we need to recreate our lineage based on like text. And when you look at text, everybody's being like, here's what the definition of this is, going back to this era. But and you're right, the word Zen comes from the word Chan. Chan is a shortened version of Chan Na, which is the Chinese pronunciation of Dhyan or Dhyana, which is a Sanskrit word, the Pali word being jhana. Jhana means like a absorption state, you know. So with Theravadan teachers, sometimes you hear them talk about entering the jhanas, which are these absorption states. So it's like, well, is Zen a school of jhana practice? You know, the etymology would indicate that it is. But even in my own, so we're talking about the difference in meaning across continents and centuries. And even in my own lifetime, the word literally actually means the opposite of what it meant when I was young. When people born in the 90s or the 2000s say the word literally, they usually mean really. But they mean really as in like a lot. like they use it for like emphasis, you know, like if they said like, oh my God, it was so funny, I literally peed my pants, you know. In the 80s, if you said I literally peed my pants, it meant that you literally peed your pants, but kids don't use it that way now, you know. Or even you know, the word emo, you know, emo meant that, you know, in the early 90s, emo meant that you listened to a specific subgenre of like post-hardcore, like Rites of Spring and Sunny Day Real Estate, very specific bands. And now it just means like you've got black hair, you wear eyeliner. It means kind of like what goth meant in the 90s, you know. So there's these words that get kind of utilized in different ways. Now, even like the word samadhi, we're using the lexicon of Buddhism to talk about Buddhism, but we're using it in very, very different ways, you know. So if you look at the outward form of jhana practice, the outward form of jhana practice is going to look like the outward form of Zen practice, you know, as opposed to recitation or something like that, you know, as opposed to study, you know. So if you're going to have a Mahayana East Asian school that is based on sitting meditation, how would you describe that outward form using the lexicon that exists? You would say they practice absorption or meditation, you know, but the way it evolved in terms of the interior discipline of what's going on is distinct. Now, one could say, and this is why we use the word samadhi, one could say the samadhi of the Zen school is sitting upright in the luminous quality of mind and the recognition of the luminous quality of mind. I would say that experientially is a qualitative difference from the Theravadan use of it. But you could still call it a kind of samadhi. You can call it the samadhi of the Zen school. So could you call it the jhana of the Zen school? Maybe, but a Theravadan would have a bone to pick with that, I think. You know, Theravadins would have a bone to pick with the way that we use the word samadhi and the way that we would use if we use the word dhyana to describe what we're doing. Because strictly speaking, it doesn't match the early definitions of it. Just like literal, the way a millennial uses it and the way I use it is going to be different, you know. Does that make sense? Okay, Tara.
Hey, Koji. I'm not
Hi.
sure if you're going to hear me very well because somebody is vacuuming. So
I can't hear it at all. You got excellent noise suppression.
Amazing. Log cap. It's good to see you. Looking forward to your spring visit, non-winter storm visit. One thing I was thinking about with your talk today, which was awesome, thank you. I think that we talk a lot, and it's the essence of what we do, or one of the essences of what we do, which is to sit with, you know, sitting upright, like you said, with luminous mind, sitting through with our feeling tones. And that's really important, and it's helped me a lot. And there are some times where I start to feel like, okay, then what? Like there's, from that place, we still act and speak and make decisions. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because you set the stage, but then when you got to the kernel of what the issue was, what is the issue?
What is the issue? I mean, I think that the longer I practice, I do experience that clarity or some clarity of mind and ability to move in the world with maybe less emotional attachment, less stories. And I think sometimes for me, it can also mean I don't know which thing that seems to be calling for my attention to respond to, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Almost like the absolute mind can be confusing if you can't bring it back to the relative and make decisions based on that.
Mhm. Mhm. What would be two things that are competing for your attention and care?
Oh goodness, every day there's so many. And sometimes it just feels a little bit like a whirling dervish. But it's been snow days, and so I can clean the house. I can go to the art studio and work on some stuff that really nourishes my soul. I could sit zazen.
Mhm.
And then at times those decisions are clear. Other times it just tugging at my pant legs, all
Yeah.
these different things.
Yeah. I used to have Instagram. I don't have it anymore because I think it made me crazy. But when you have Instagram, so the first thing is you decide to take a picture, right? Or you decide to post a picture. The second decision you have to make is what filter you put on. And you have 28 different filters you can put on. You've got Playa, you've got Carnival, I don't know what they're called. You got all kinds of different grotto, whatever. And they're different kinds of highlights and lowlights, warms, more reds, more blues. Is it going to be grayscale? Is it going to be just black and white monochromatic or something like that? And sometimes I found that I would be going back and forth between two different ones. Do I want Valencia or do I want crema? Do I want Valencia or do I want crema? And it turns out the reason I can't decide is because it doesn't fucking matter. So I wonder if that could be the problem.
That tracks. Thank you.
Anyone else with questions or comments?
I have a question. Koji, I'm so happy that you're here. Thank you for your talk. I always appreciate it. I'm curious if you have a recommendation on, maybe you said it, but if there's a text that would give me an idea of the context of the Taoism and how I could track a little better where all this stuff comes from and be able to hold it in it. Because when you talk about it, it was oh my goodness, of course, that makes so much sense, especially the Confucianism and the way of being together. And I was wow, I've never heard that. That is so cool. So thank you for that. And I wish I had a little more of that knowledge myself. When the visitor today said, what's the difference between Japanese Buddhism and Vietnamese Buddhism? I was oh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. So if you have an idea of how I could educate myself a little better, that would be great.
Yeah. So, there was this really great video that I found one day that I have never been able to find since. And if anyone wants to use their Google wisdom, there's a scholar lecturing on, it's a 6-minute video, and it's called The Magical Properties of Li. And it was about it's a lecture on the idea of ritual propriety, which I thought was really, really, I'm this is really helpful for sharing with Zen students. I encountered it through living at a Chinese monastery and just studying Confucianism. But a couple of things, if you wanted an actual book that helps you trace how Zen became Zen, really Musong, who is a Indian man who was ordained in the Korean tradition, that's where the name Musong came from. He wrote a book called Trust in Mind, I think it was called. And it was actually a text about that first Zen text. So Trust in Mind is a Zen text that's 1 page. And he wrote a whole book about it because he's this is the Taoist influence of Chan. This is the Buddhist influence of Chan. This is on this text and how this text arose as a synthesis of these ideas. So I think that could be really helpful. If you're willing to kind of just expose yourself to some of it and read between the lines, you could watch the Confucius movie. There's a movie about the life of Confucius. Now, Confucius is a Latinization of Kung Fu Tzu, or Kung Tzu. Tzu is a suffix which kind of means like gentleman. So it's like gentleman Kong. Chow Yun-fat, who's of like martial arts fame, like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and all of that, he was in a movie where he played Confucius, and you could watch it on YouTube for free, I think. And you could just watch the mannerisms and the, you know, in pre-Buddhist China, to watch the way that people share space together. You'll even recognize, oh, that's like Shashu, you know, the way they hold their hands and stuff like that. And you can kind of see the function of ritual life in pre-Buddhist China. So that could be really helpful. But I think if I was going to recommend any one text, I would say that Musong book, and then just like get curious about Chinese philosophy. You know, watch YouTube videos, those animated YouTube videos that describe Confucianism. You know, that like kind of look like an episode of South Park, but it teaches you philosophy in like 6 minutes. Those are great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Ken's been wanting to ask something for a minute.
Yeah, thank you, Koji, again. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you're always so informative, and I'm so grateful. I'd just like what you said about continually being embarrassed about who you were 2 weeks ago, and having compassion for that person is so moving. But I'd like to, could you maybe clarify and go, I'm fascinated by this distinction you made between Samadhi in the Theravada tradition and the Zen tradition. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit, go into what Samadhi is in the Zen tradition. Maybe,
yeah.
I know you touched on it, but if you could maybe indulge me a little.
Yeah. So if you encounter if you encounter meditation methodology from a kind of orthodox early Buddhist point of view, that says, you know, don't get distracted, stay with the breath, or stay with some kind of subject, stay with some kind of meditation object.
Yeah.
It can be such that staying with that meditation object can create a very kind of distilled, crystalline an experience that you can get really excited about, you know, an experience that you can come to love, you know, and it's just like, wow, I am not distracted. I feel completely blissed out and complete in this moment, you know. And then I've encountered it such that even though there isn't a lot of concentration emphasis in Zen, when people go live in monasteries and you have, you know, all of your external stripped away, you got no screens, you got no Wi-Fi, you got no, in my day at Tassajara, we had no electricity, most of us. And you sit, you know, about 6 hours a day, if it was a session, and there was a week-long session every month, and you sit 10 hours a day. And then when you come out of that, like everything outside the gate is like, you know, depending on your temperament, either really good news or really bad news. Either way, destructive. You know, if it was really good news, then it was like, you know, a kind of what's the word? Hedonic sense endeavor, you know, or if it's like really overwhelming, then it's like, so it can create, and I know a lot of people that lived in a monastery, and at a certain point they didn't live in a monastery anymore, and their whole kind of meditative life kind of unraveled because the monastery didn't give you, they couldn't get their sea legs in the world, you know, because the monastery gave you your bones didn't get to set or something like that, you know. You were gelatinous. All the meditation made you gelatinous, All the meditation made all of your sensory experiences way overstimulating and made them bad news. And you had such a strong preference for that kind of absorption and concentration state. And so I think there's a way, so the Zen critique on the conventional early Buddhist jhana practice, samadhi practice, is that it creates a dichotomy where you become very, very dependent and preferential on a life that is really, really removed from the world and responsibilities.
Okay.
And it is a life that is sustained by monasticism, and monasticism is sustained by the charity of others. So it's a hard thing to actually do. And you actually, it's so easy for monks to pat themselves on the back for being free from distraction. But I mean, they got old ladies kneeling down to feed them every day, and all of their achievements wouldn't exist without that. They live in a social contract where they're supported, and it's really kind of like a spiritual fiefdom or something like that. So if your meditative experience is supported by setting up, and Paula Arai says this really well. She said, she was talking about how in Japan all the monks started to marry, but only the male monks, and so even to this day, if you meet a Japanese Buddhist priest that's a Japanese woman, they're usually not married. But if you meet a priest that's a man, he usually is. Why would that be? Because of the social norms in Japan, for a priest to marry means he gets to hand off his social responsibilities, his householder responsibilities. So marriage is a monk's way out of social responsibilities, and celibacy is a nun's way out of social responsibilities because of what it means to be a man and a woman in Japan. It's very interesting, but I think in order to sustain that kind of jhana practice, you do need a supported way out of social responsibilities. That's why the whole Vipassana world in the US is a lot of wealthy people, because they could go to Barre, Massachusetts for 3 months, and they have the $8,000 to do that and also maintain their mortgage or rent at their San Francisco loft or whatever. And it's like our practice is kind of working class practice, and it's just kind of like, I'm not developing a strong preference for absorption. I'm developing a body mind that can metabolize everything that's coming in without responding with attachment and aversion. So there's less frosting on it, there's less gravy in it, but it creates a kind of sustainable relationship with everything that you're going to encounter, because you're not, you don't go into I knew a guy that did so much Vipassana that when he came into the Tassajara kitchen, which is not a hectic place, he wore earplugs, because he's so used to, he wants his samadhi, like, actually, you can't have earplugs in a kitchen, homie. You gotta know I'm behind you, the samadhi that we're developing is the samadhi of imperturbability in life as it is, and you go even beyond that, imperturbability with our perturbability with life as it is.
Yeah. That's like the heart of it, ain't it?
Mm.
It's like, touching those places where you're not with it.
Mm. And it's like I said,
I appreciate that. Yeah, your comments about that as a critique of the sort of insularity of monastic practice. It's been in my mind. I'm so grateful for your
Thanks. Yeah, and it's really, my teacher lived at the monastery he lived at Tassajara for like 15 years, and as soon as you took him out, it's like it never happened. Because he didn't develop anything that he was able to integrate.
It makes me think of like tantric practice. It's supposed to be the householders.
Yeah.
path, like a somewhere between Theravada and
Yeah.
Tantra.
Because there's no strong preference. You don't have this strong preference for peace. You know.
But I do. Okay.
And so when you catch yourself having a strong preference for peace, it's like I said last time I was there, it's like, why wouldn't I? Responding. So that's the imperturbability with our perturbability. It's like, why wouldn't I want to be okay? Why wouldn't I feel agitated? And then as soon as you say, why wouldn't I, it becomes less of a problem,
Yeah.
Hmm.
Wow. Thank you.
Well, now we really are running out of time.
Okay.
But thank you